Hello everyone, welcome to Mastermind. In this video, let us continue our discussion on fundamental rights. Fundamental rights. So in this, we have already made 7 parts and we have discussed previous articles, and in the previous video, we have discussed 3 most important doctrines which is related to Article 13 of Indian Constitution for us. So let us look at all the fundamental rights first. So, totally, initially, there were 7 fundamental rights. Why am I telling initially 7 fundamental rights? Is the point of discussion itself for this particular lesson. So, first one is right to equality. Second is right to freedom. Third one is right against exploitation. Then, right against exploitation. Then there is right to freedom of religion. Then there is cultural and educational rights, and you have right to property, which was removed, and then a right to constitutional remedies. So these are some of the important rights which has been given in the fundamental rights for us. Okay, so which is equality, freedom, exploitation, religion, cultural and educational rights, right to property, and right to constitutional remedies. Like I said, initially there were 7 different fundamental rights, 7 composition in the fundamental rights, but right to property was removed. Right to property was removed. Okay, and this was repealed, or this was removed by 44th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1978. This question has been asked multiple times. Right to property was removed from fundamental rights, and which amendment act removed it? It is 44th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1978. So at present, if you are looking at, then there are 6 fundamental rights, which is equality, freedom, exploitation, religion, cultural and educational rights. Again, I'll write it as E only, and last one is R. So you can remember it as EF, ER, ER. So any shortcut for that matter, if you are able to recall it, it is easier for you. E for equality, then you have freedom. You have freedom. Then you have right against exploitation. It is not right to, it is right against exploitation. Then you have freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, and last you have right to constitutional remedies. So if you are looking at fundamental rights chapter also, after every individual article you also find exceptions to all the important articles. That is, this right is provided, but there will be some conditions. So those conditions are also important. So like we had started this series itself in order to understand the important articles, that is every individual articles, to look at every individual articles was the aim for us, correct? But in this case we are taking longer duration because we are covering fundamental rights over here. And like I've explained previously also, fundamental rights is most important part when it comes to examination. Now we saw that right to property was removed. Right to property. So some points we'll look at with respect to right to property. So the first one is, which article gave the right to property initially when the constitution came into force? It is Article 31. Article 31 is related to right to property. Now, when the right to property was removed, do we not have any rights related to property? We do have rights related to property, but it is not a fundamental right. It is not a fundamental right. It became a legal right. We will understand it in more detail. It is now a legal right. So if they are asking you in the examination, right to property is, first one they'll give it as fundamental right, constitutional right, then legal right, etc. The answer is legal right. At present, which article speaks about this? So in the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, it was removed this fundamental right to property was removed, and it was placed under article 300A. Article 300A of which part? Part 12. So these parts are also important because recently you might have seen 2024 prelims. They are directly asked questions which included the article and part as well, and hence it will be important for us. So in the constitution, it establishes not as a fundamental right but as a legal right. So at present you can say that there are only 6 important fundamental rights which is in place at this point of a time. Now, what is the reason for the removal of this right to property from fundamental rights? That is also something which you have to know. So, when we got independence, just before that, lands were distributed across various territories, and every most of the times the landlords or zamindars, they had over, let's say, 500 acres, 1000 acres of land. So we had to distribute this equally. That is, we had to bring land reforms. Because at that point of a time, India was very new. That is, it had recently got independence also, and land reforms was very important for us and a crucial step at that point of a time. But how does a government take away land from the landlords or zamindars? So when the government decided to have the land distribution for the sake of land acquisition, at that point of a time, when the government wanted to acquire the land, there were lot of litigations in the court. Which were in the court. That is, if land was taken off from a zamindar, will that person be silent? No, they will go to the court of law, right? And first of all, it is a fundamental right. At that point of a time, right to property was a fundamental right, and hence they would go to the court, Supreme Court, directly. And when it is a fundamental right, they can directly go to the court, and they can say that the right has been violated, and they can approach the Supreme Court directly. At that point of a time, even Supreme Court can issue writs as well. So it was becoming very difficult for the government in order to distribute the land, and that was one of the socialistic goals also. Okay, so it was very much necessary to fulfill this socialistic goal of the government. And that point of a time, there was lot of litigations also which were going inside the court, and government was not able to take proper step related to that. And hence what happened is, in 1978, government brought an amendment which was 44th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1978. This was enacted by Parliament, and this Constitution Amendment, it is not that it made changes only to the right to property. No, there were a lot of changes which were made by 44th Constitutional Amendment Act also and 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act also. See, it is 1978, so it is, let's say, some 2 years after emergency also, during the emergency as well. So there were a lot of regulations which had to be made. When we'll be discussing about emergency provisions, we'll see that a lot of regulations were added by 44th Constitution Amendment Act also with respect to president. So the satisfaction of the president, etc. Those were added in the 44th Constitution Amendment Act. So many changes were brought in, and one of the most significant change at that point of a time was removal of right to property from Part 3 of the Constitution. This was very, very important. Now, at that point of a time, it doesn't mean that government will directly take away all the lands at that point of a time. When a person's land is taken, when, let's say, zamindar's land or a landlord's land is being taken, it doesn't mean that once the right is removed, they cannot go to court to approach. They can go, but it is no more a fundamental right. Even after that, when it is placed under Article 300A of Part 12 of Indian Constitution, it allows the state to acquire the land. Land acquisition was made easy. Now also the state can acquire, but there were two important conditions. First one was the acquisition has to be for public purpose only. It was for the public purpose only. Next one, it should provide payment, that is, there has to be compensation which has to be provided for the owner. That is, if there is, let's say, 500 acres of land with one person, XYZ, and we have to take away, let's say, 400 acres out from this, so that we distribute it among the peasants will be growing, farmers will be growing in that particular land later on. So for this 400 acres which has been taken away from XYZ, the compensation also has to be paid by the government because they have taken the land from them. And at present, if you are looking at the right to property, it is a legal right which you have seen here, and it is not a constitutional right or a fundamental right as such. That means when it is made a legal right, that means normal law can be made in order to make changes to it. But when it was a constitutional right, when it was constitutional right, we had to bring constitutional amendment only to make changes to it. So that is the difference. When it is made a legal right, it means that it can be regulated also, it can be curtailed by the law also, and for that you don't need any constitutional amendment. But if it was a fundamental right, at that point of time, any changes or any violation to that, we had to bring constitutional amendment. So that is one of the most important points which you have to remember when it comes to right to property. That doesn't mean that the person whose land has been lost cannot approach the court. They can always approach the court. They can approach the high court, and there they can file the petition as well. But previously they could approach the Supreme Court directly, when the weightage on the Supreme Court would also increase and the land reforms would not happen that properly. So I hope you have understood about right to property, which has been removed. What it was previously, it was under Article 31. Now it is what? It is a legal right. In what part of the constitution it exists now? It is in part 12. What article? It is 300A. I hope you have understood about right to property. In the next part, let us start from the constitution itself. That is, as we were discussing the articles taken directly from the constitution, we'll start from the next part, that is from right to equality.